This book went a long way in discussing things which are otherwise not discussed, and that's exactly what this platform is about. There was a point in your boarding school where you drank bleach. What could have been that bad?
I was so overcome by shame, and I thought it was better to be dead than live life as a shameful woman.
Onto the targets in a very short duration of time.
In the brief moments that she appeared on screen, I felt as if I could see my future unfold. I wanted to be Barkadat. Purely as a woman, she symbolized hope.
Here is a message from Barkha, especially for you.
Your words really moved me to tears.
I'm gonna cry.
Some stories need to be told, not because they talk about big incidents, but because they address the unspoken internal emotional turmoil of childhood that has repercussions in adulthood. How we shape up as individuals, our self confidence or lack of it, how we deal with conflict, how we express ourselves in love, because it's in childhood that these blueprints are formed. Today, we are joined by Meera Vijayann, whose book Girls Who Said Nothing and Everything takes us on an honest but unsettling ride about growing up in Sivakasi, a city in Tamil Nadu infamous for the production of firecrackers and safety matches. It allows us a peek into Meera's childhood in a patriarchal, emotionally unpredictable, and dare I say dysfunctional family. The book pokes holes in our traditional family systems that have long functioned because no one dared question it. It raises questions about caste discrimination, how we, without even realizing, inherit emotional and mental health issues from our parents, just like they did from theirs. It talks about the deep inner battle for personal power. And all of this enmeshed in a silence so deep that it cuts like a knife. The harassment that we as young girls in India overlook. The book is an ode to the remarkable resilience of girls in small town India and, dare I say, entire India. Meera, thank you for being on Zen-Brain from Sivakasi to Seattle. That's where you're joining us from. And for turning your life into a mirror of sorts in which so many Indian women will finally see themselves.
Thank you so much for having me, Shruti. Absolutely wonderful to be here.
Here's a disclaimer. This is not to blame parents because I do believe most parents do the best they can in the circumstances. But discussions like these on Zen Brain is to bring awareness about things that remain unsaid, unspoken, and unresolved in childhood. And they may lead to, and they do often lead to major mental health repercussions in adulthood. So, Meera, do you agree that growing up in a family where anger, silence, or unpredictable emotions dominate often leaves deep psychological imprints? And in which case, what long term mental health patterns did you recognize in yourself as a result of this, even if it was only later as an adult?
I think for me, like one of the things that I noticed very early on is how much I feared even the smallest thing. Like, when I was in my early 20s and moved out of home, and that was the first time I was navigating the world, and my boss would say something like, be at the office at 9 o'clock. I would take it very literally that because I was raised in a way that it was punitive to be even a minute late. It is like so many of those things growing up in boarding school, the slightest setbacks are not allowed. You're not allowed to be late. You're shamed for the smallest of things. And I felt that I carried that sense of fear and anxiety around perfection for a long time. In my 20s, especially, once you get to the stage of entering the workforce, you understand that traffic is a real thing. Day to day life is a real thing. If you're raised in a way that is extremely punitive, there are many ways in which that kind of shows up. Fear around, not being perfect or good enough. For me, it was a fear of constantly being watched. In my first job, I used to be terrified of like speaking up for myself because I was like, oh, I cannot speak to people who are older than me in a disrespectful way. I think for me, like a lot of those things small behaviors were the things that I noticed
Mm.
very early on in my 20s. Things that people usually took for granted deeply affected me. I never understood why until much later on.
Do you believe that patriarchy in small town India and in cities, to be honest, is invisible because it's so normalized? So, was there a specific moment in your childhood when the injustice of being a girl became apparent to you?
I think it was very apparent to me from the time I was very young. And the way it was apparent to me was very, very normal. I'm talking about young girls. From the time they're young, they understand that they're not really allowed to play outside. The most that I was allowed outside was when my cousins would come home, and I've written about this in the book. They would come home, they would just cycle over to our home, and I was quite amazed by that liberty they had. They were just like a year older and a year younger than me, my first cousins. But when they are with us, we could cycle around the colony. They are like around the same age, yet the world is very different for them. You know, for us, I remember that our first home, very small home with a big yard, had like this green gate. And for me, it was like, beyond this green gate, I'm not allowed. Often my parents will use terms, it's not safe. But they will never say safe from what? Why is it safe for them and not for me? Those explanations were never given. That was the reality in Sivakasi. It still is.
It's not just small town India, I mean, India per se, right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
let's address that a little bit. To be fair, parents do that for the safety of the girls that they have. And we understand that now in retrospect. Why do you think it is important for parents to talk about why?
And I think that's a very important conversation to have, no matter which part of the world you're living in. I mean, I have a daughter. I will definitely have those conversations with her. As a parent now, how do I explain the world to my child who will not understand it? But at the same time, I try to not limit her world because these evils exist. I want her to be prepared for it. When I was young, it wasn't explained to me, but it was always that it's not safe, and that's the same thing they said at school. This is not safe, therefore, we will keep the girls contained, whereas the boys had access to this whole world. The whole campus, which was a very, very large campus, they had a lovely time. Not that we didn't have our own joys and our own happiness and our own fun moments, but it was contained. It was so intensely limited, and we were confronted with reality much earlier than any of the boys my own age. And one of the things I still remember is that when I was 16 or 17, and we moved to the city because my mother got cancer, and I had this intense argument with my father, and I said, why would you not let me go out? Like, I am now in my first year of college. Let me go out. In a burst of anger, he told me, well, I can't control them, but I can control you. In my head, I thought, I don't want you to control me. It filled me with so much rage. Perhaps as a parent, every parent would think, yeah, that's totally valid, because there is real harm that women face. The real sexual harassment, sexual violence is a very, very brutal reality of our daily lives. But at the same time, I think that parents need to know how to navigate that and not kind of like push the burden so much on daughters, groom them to make themselves small in the face of patriarchy, and crush their own dreams so that they will be safe. And the sense of safety becomes very suffocating after a while, because at some point you do have to go out in the world. So many things that I wanted to do in my life, I slowly cut away career choices. Oh, I want to be a wildlife photographer. It's not safe. Let me not do it. I want to like be this reporter and go and report all over India. No, no, that's not safe. Safety becomes a way to really crush women. Women also normalize it. Like that point for me, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. One of the things when I'm talking to my daughter, even now, is that to look at safety as something that is important not just for her, but for her brother. What support she has from us while she navigates this world, versus we won't let you do this because this world is that way. Because we don't do the same for boys. We don't say all the boys are like running amok and like harassing people. Now, I don't think any of the boys I grew up with who are now men, who may be living their own lives, um, have ever faced any kind of accountability for any of the things that they may have done. I see that through the prism of my father, who is conservative, who is a traditionalist, who always believed women should be a certain way. Women in his family were not highly educated and they were married young, and he didn't want the same for us. So, he wanted us to kind of thrive and go out and do all of these things, but at the same time had those expectations of what constitutes a safe career, a safe image. That's something I think about a lot.
Meera, you've brought up a very interesting and important contradiction that we live in, especially where women are concerned. We are constantly taught how to be fearful instead of fearless. And that is what I got from your book as well. You were constantly told to do this, to go out and achieve something, but do it in the constraints of society. This happens, I think, also when women are brought up to be working women and then constantly told, now get married. Let's talk about how blatantly patriarchy shows up even in school, and in your case boarding school. By the way, I went to boarding school, so I could totally relate to that aspect. So take us through what became a defining lesson for you as a young girl there.
Boarding school was liberating in some ways in that my parents were not always there. It was not as liberating in other ways in that school comes with its own kind of rules, its own set of regiments, and like its own belief system. So I feel like when I went to school, it was a very different time. It was the early 90s. Like there was this one little culvert, like a bench, which was there. And the girls were not allowed past that. Our world was just the girls' cottages and the small little yard in front of the girls' cottages, on which we'll play hopscotch or run and catch or like things like that. Whereas if you're a boy, you can participate in a lot more games, you can walk around all over campus, you can do all of those things. Those didn't strike me as injustices because that was the same life that I had in Sivakasi. It's something I began to question as I grew older. It's something I began to question, say, after I hit puberty, people start like having crushes and they go through the cycle of early adolescence and womanhood. They want to spend time with boys, but they're told that boys are not safe. You want to have a boyfriend, but somehow boys are not safe. There's a lot of conflicting emotions that you're dealing with. You're not taught about sex education at all. You're only taught sex is bad. You have to be virginal and chaste and pure till you get married. And I remember in school when we started asking these questions, we got punished a lot more. And the more we got punished, the more we became rebellious. And it became extremely punitive to be a girl because by the time I was in 11th standard, there was this thing that if you have loose hair and you don't tie your hair in a ponytail, that is attracting boys. The whole idea of temptation is kind of thrown in once you hit puberty. It's like you're at fault no matter what. You're at fault by merely being a girl.
It's
Yeah.
often extremely subtle. In boarding school, what stood out for me is the kind of harassment that you face from senior boys that you kind of overlook. The maths teacher who's dismissive of girls, who's touching girls inappropriately. These are all
Yeah.
concepts that every girl can relate to. We can put a name and a face to every incident, right?
Yeah.
Even when you and your boyfriend are caught together, it's you who's given the warning, not the boy, right? So have your freedom as a woman, but have them within boundaries. It's almost that.
The sense of shame. Like you have to be ashamed, deeply ashamed of like the smallest things. This goes back to my earlier point that merely being a girl and doing things or having any curiosity about the world comes with a deep sense of shame. You cannot be curious about having a boyfriend and just as a 13-year-old without being told that you're like being sinful. You're not seen as like a fully human person with desires, with emotions. You're supposed to be ashamed of it, and you better be ashamed of it because if you're not ashamed of it, there's something wrong with you. There were a lot of girls who I really looked up to who were like, yeah, I'd break up with somebody, I'd date somebody, and none of these people are going to be my husband, and that's okay. And then very quickly they'd be termed the loose ones. That deeply affected me. When you're that young, you really want to be on the good team. You really want to be like appreciated and looked at as a good person and not be a bad person in any way. So you really try very hard to kind of cope with that sense of shame. Once you learn that as a child, it goes way beyond the psychological toll of that shame.
So, Meera, Zen-Brain is a platform for conversations around neuroscience and emotional and mental health. This book went a long way in discussing things which are otherwise not discussed, and that's exactly what this platform is about. And that's why I bring this up. There was a point in your boarding school where you drank bleach. Why did you do this? And what was going through your mind at that time? I mean, what could have been that bad?
Yes, I was so overcome by shame, and I thought it was better to be dead than live life as a shameful woman. Like, I truly thought that there's nothing worse than my parents having like a bad name in the community. The Tamil Nadar community almost functions fully on image. The burden of like keeping that image up falls heavily on women. You're told you're stupid because you're a girl, you cannot do maths. And then if you're good, you cannot be too smart because you're a show off, you're arrogant. So I think girls, like young girls, are constantly trying to balance that. They're like trying not to outshine somebody. I was like, I think 15 or 16 years old when this happened. There was no greater terror than actually confronting my parents about this life that I was living in school. I knew their conservatism, don't talk to boys, good girls get married to men that are chosen for them. It's an entirely different landscape when you come from a town. Entire communities are impacted. Like when that happened, I just thought, okay, I'd rather be dead than talk this through with my parents. I did it instantaneously and I thought, this is a good idea. Let me just end my life. I won't have to deal with my parents, but most importantly, my parents don't have to deal with me. And I just thought that's an easy way out. Nothing happened. And then I was horrified that nothing happened. And then I had to like go through living my life. I carried a very, very deep sense of shame because my parents didn't really come to my side. They didn't comfort me. Rather, it was just this thing that kind of hung over my family for years and years and years and years and years. It was something that was never mentioned. That sense of shame never left me.
Meera, you
Um,
talk about your peer group, your girls around
mhm.
you actually being extremely supportive, uh,
Yes.
but authority letting you down because suicide ideation is something that is being talked about today and it's rising amongst teens in India. This is a lesson for parents as well as people who are in authority in schools. What are the signs to watch out for and how can they do better?
I wish I had one single answer, but from personal experience, what I sometimes wish I had is what I hope that other kids who are growing up and facing pressures on their own will have. That is an emotional support system. I don't think any kind of authorities in school or at home allow emotional support, allow kindness, or like allow comfort for children. I think they look at children as people who ought to be molded and people who don't have their own thoughts and views on life because they're young. And I think that is like a very wrong approach to take because young people are real people. They have emotions. They are living their own realities. They are living in a reality which adults don't even understand. My parents got married young. They did not date. They didn't know anything about my life. And I wish that they had asked me the question and tried to understand me rather than instill a fear of authority so deeply that you look at authority and you just feel fear. When young people look at authority, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a school counselor, young people should look at you and think of you as a safe psychological space, a safe emotional space. And I think that's very lacking in our society in general. I don't think young people have a space to go and say, I need help without being judged or mocked or like told that whatever they're feeling is not that important because it is important. They are making sense of the world how much ever of the world they know. That is the world they know. And that is the extent of the world they know. And I wish that adults didn't have such a patronizing view towards young people. So that is what I'd hope.
That's a wonderful takeaway. Safe space rather than a judgmental one. So I think whoever's watching, if you are in a place of authority or even as a parent, think about that. Meera, let's talk about growing up as a girl in India and the harassment and abuse that we often ignore, overlook, normalize, as we've spoken about. You talk about harassment by older boys in boarding school that I just brought up, the body shaming that is done in jest almost, right? Which girls are forced to ignore. You don't want to spark any kind of repercussion, so you keep quiet. You speak about a tutor who puts his hands under your skirt. You don't tell your mother
Yeah.
or anyone about it. You speak about an incident on a bus where a stranger shows you pictures of nude women. Again, as an Indian woman, we tend to sadly overlook and normalize these incidents. Why do you think that is, first of all? And what impact, in your experience, could it have as an adult?
For me, like one of the things that I began developing when I was like a teenager, and I think like this happened in 99, when rows of boys would be like, just hanging off the railings. We had like a kind of we had a block which was you can only enter the block one way. So you can only go around in a circle. And both sides there would be boys who are catcalling. And it was kind of horrifying that these were people you studied with, they're not your own classmates, but your own classmates wouldn't say much because they would get bullied if they stood up for you. So the power that boys had, we could see how they could use it because the ratio between boys and girls is very skewed. The power dynamic shifts a lot. And in my school, it was like what 120, about 110 to 120 girls to about 500 or so boys. And I feel like it wasn't until we understood that term, learned indifference, that okay, you can keep calling me. We know that you won't be held accountable, but let me just let you know that in my own way, that none of the things that you say bothers me. And that's when the catcalling would stop. You learn that in school, and then it just becomes a way of life, that the teacher does that. You understand the power dynamics there. You start to adapt yourself to the power dynamic. Even when I'm traveling by buses, which I used to do a lot in my 20s, um this hypervigilance, you're like very focused on smallest slightest body language which is a little off, the slight stare, the smirk. You learn what can you be indifferent to, what will you not be indifferent to, how do you protect yourself. And I feel like for me, that thing when it happened when I was with the maths tutor, that happened continuously. And my sister was in the room and she was like my baby sister. And it's a memory that both of us shared, but we never ever talked about it. And I think it was in adulthood when I asked her, like, do you remember this? And she said, yes, I do. We could not talk about sexual assault like that. Sexual assault wasn't in my vocabulary. It was that you better not let men do this.
And if it
Yes,
happened, it was your fault.
because I was always told, don't talk to men, don't talk to boys. And now my teacher is like a man. Those conversations you can't really have if you're taught that something is wrong. And my mother asked me, why wouldn't you tell me? Well, but I was also fearful of her moods, of her reactions. Like my whole life evolved around like managing other people's moods, kind of shaping myself to kind of what is acceptable behavior.
Extremely subtle, but it has
Mhm.
a deep, deep impact. Unpredictable behavior of your caregivers, where
Yeah.
you don't know how your parent is going to react, how angry that person is going to get. And so you live in a constant state of, like you said, hypervigilance, panic mode, stress. And when you're
Mhm.
constantly stressed, you become an individual that becomes extremely stressed when you grow up in the workforce. You're generally more stressed than other people. So this
Yes.
state of stress that you're constantly living in, why is it important to address this? Why is it important for parents to understand that unpredictable behavior is not good for the child, is detrimental for the growth of the child?
I don't think we're taught as a society, and I know I'm making a blanket statement here, but just having noticed so many layers of living in India for 29 years, I've noticed living in different cities, being in different communities, I've noticed that we are not taught anything about emotional regulation at all. We are not taught that our emotions have any impact on other people. When is anger a problem versus when is anger an acceptable response to something? When is anger like a response to an injustice? And I feel like for me, that was completely warped. What emotions I'm allowed to feel as a child was completely warped. I just knew that there were certain things that were not acceptable at all. One thing is you cannot say anything about your parents against your parents. You're somehow ungrateful all the time. And I feel like those things really impact the way we view our caregivers and how we like walk on eggshells around them all the time. And it's not just me doing that. I see my mother doing that with her father and her parents too. I see my father, like, recently had a heart surgery and not tell his aging my grandmother because he's like, oh no, she will ask me a lot of questions. And I was like, but you are like in your late 60s. Like it doesn't end. You see the cycle doesn't end. You never stop being a child in the Indian context because the concept of adulthood is very loose for us. I don't think the power dynamic ever shifts. We don't ever get to a point where parent and child can sit and recognize each other's emotions and um, understand and empathize with each other in a way that people do in many other cultures. And I'm sure like in India, like there's a lot of wonderful families who have this privilege of like being totally functional, and but all of those functional families will have one thing in common, that is they're all emotionally regulated. They all deeply respect each other as individuals. And I think like when that concept of especially in very traditional families and communities, the concept of individuality, the concept of like, image matters much more. The price one pays emotionally is very, very high. When I think about my mom, her anger or my father's anger manifests very cold. He'll just shut himself down. And I knew from the time I was young that if my father doesn't speak, that means he's like very angry. Whereas my mother will like scream and shout. Before I say something to them, in my own head, I've gone through the lines because I'm preparing myself. Which response am I okay with? Growing up in that kind of environment, you crush your own emotions, your own like emotional growth gets stunted because you're consistently managing their emotions. Like you want them to be kind of stable. Let me not really share how I feel.
You've spoken about how you felt that it was your responsibility to take care of their happiness. And it's an unfair of a child to have that responsibility, to constantly make your parents happy. And I want viewers to really understand this concept of emotional regulation because it's not something we have been taught growing up. And even as a child, you respect that child's individuality, something that we again don't do. In fact, things perhaps may be changing a little bit now. And I want to quickly focus on your obsession with cleanliness. And why I do that is also because we are Zen-Brain, we talk about emotional and mental health. I could completely relate to your boarding school experience, filthy bathrooms, water shortage, holding your need to go to the bathroom, and in your case, your obsessive need to cleanse yourself, which ultimately led to a diagnosis of OCD as an adult.
I struggled with that for a long time, and people often use OCD as a verb. It's not something to be taken lightly. I, through many years of therapy, understood where the seed of that was laid. And I grew up in small towns, rituals are everything. And I grew up in a very ritualistic community. My father, because he was a practicing Hindu, he focused on cleanliness a lot. It all comes off as very normal because, of course, we wash our hands before we eat. But then it would go on to you have to wash your feet before bed. If you don't wash your feet before bed, that's not a good thing. And it's not explained why it's not a good thing. And because I would think of him and I'd get homesick, I would constantly wash my feet. And I would wash my feet with freezing cold water, and I would wash it and wash it and wash it. And then it became a ritual. Writing Sri Ram in like a book, like repetitively, was like a thing. So it's called Sri Ramajayam. So they would write Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Sri Ram. So my dad had these ritualistic practices which he said I should do. And so I would do it every day. Like one day I wouldn't be able to write it. I'd have severe anxiety. Then I'd have to do it again. But that went on for years and years, and it snowballed with other issues that I was really facing, like cleanliness of toilets. I couldn't deal with it. Like it affected me physically, mentally, emotionally. It almost became psychotic. A drop of water would fall on me. I would just panic and I would tell my friends, no, I have to go. I have to like wash this off me. So it became a joke among my friends for a little while. It took many years till I was in pregnancy. I started cleaning things obsessively, like, cleaning my hands with Lysol. That my husband was like, this is not normal at all because you're not sleeping. You're just thinking about contamination all the time. I was diagnosed with OCD. I'm still working on it, but it very much functions like an addiction. I'm very careful with my children. I don't confuse regular notions of cleanliness with ritualistic behavior. And because that very quickly turns into addictive behavior. And it manifests mentally in many ways. And I have seen that with my father and my grandfather. Patriarchy affects men differently, and they are men of a different generation. And it almost like it's very crippling. Like once ritualistic practices take hold of your psyche, you begin to think that that is the only way that you can live, you can be pure. Because when I was married, I used to tell my husband, you have to wash your feet. And he was like, what? Like, why? And like, he's not even Indian. So it was even more confusing for him. Like, why am I washing my feet before I get into bed? Because I had someone challenge me who was outside my family, outside my culture. It was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. In my 30s, I asked my mom, did you know that, I have OCD? And she's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, why wouldn't you take that seriously? And I don't think we take certain
Behaviors.
behaviors, say certain behaviors, we don't treat them with any kind of concern. And OCD is like not one of the things that they see as like psychologically damaging. What we consider as issues that need therapy are all extreme, I talk about therapy, like it's a topic which is fraught in our community. It's like, why? Like, nothing's wrong with me. I can talk to my friend. A therapeutic conversation is not therapy. Looking at a problem with a professional is completely different. So, that is something I learned in my life.
So you've spoken about caste discrimination growing up, and this is a reality in India. And
Yeah.
as part of the Tamil Nadu community. But I was appalled to read about the incident when your car is surrounded by a mob and it's burnt because of caste. This must have been a very traumatic incident in your life. There are other ways in which caste discrimination shows up. These kind of have severe repercussions in your adult life.
Everyone around me were Nadars. Whether they were Christian or Hindu, they were all Nadars.
Very briefly, give us a background.
There was not that much literature on OBCs or, the nitty gritty of OBC castes and subcastes that exist in India. We have so many branches of caste, right? And for us, like caste is such a complex topic because when we look at caste, we often look at the hierarchy of caste. But within these hierarchies exist other hierarchies of oppression. Within the Tamil Nadar community, there are Adi Nadars who are like, who have their own beliefs. There are like the Nadar community that I come from who have their own beliefs. So there are various subcastes of Nadars. So when I say Nadars, I'm primarily talking about the people who are in like Tuticorin, Satur, Erode, so certain districts which are heavily populated by this community, which was a community that is a lower caste community, but that was above Shudras. They were palm tree climbers. But sometime in the early 20th century, the community, they entered the trades and were able to kind of have social mobility. And they, campaigned with the government and then they got classified in OBC. The community went on to have its own bank. So the Tamil Nadu Mercantile Bank, for instance, like everything is Nadar controlled in the areas that you come from. It is like a very town-centric community. If you go to Chennai, you're hit with Brahmin culture. That was not my reality at all till I turned 16. We knew one or two Brahmins. Everyone we knew were minorities. When this incident happened with people trying to burn our car, I was young. I was 4 years old. I remember the incident vaguely. I remember like bending down and that there were people with trying to burn our car outside. But the person who was driving the car was my mother. She, I don't think, got over that. Every year she will suddenly like send a message or, do you remember the riots? I'll be the only one who says yes, I did, because I was a child then. It was me and my youngest sister. My youngest sister was a very small child. She was probably one, so obviously she has no memory. But my memory of it is that there are flames and my mother's yelling at this person, and then we get home and it's forgotten. The way my parents explained it to me is that they didn't explain the caste system. They just explained it as this is one community fighting against another community. So the word they would use is community. They will never use caste. You never read about that stuff in the news. Then again in like 96, once my mother just said, there's riots and we need to like hide. And then we had to turn off the lights for like 2 days. And then people were throwing rocks and everything at our house. And we had to just sit very still behind our sofa in the living room, and we just stayed there. We just did what my parents asked us to do. And next day, like we walked out into the veranda, and like our glass door was like broken, and like there was glass everywhere. But my parents just went about their day. But why were they fighting? No idea. Like, what is caste? No idea. Those things I kind of like stumbled into like when I entered college. The city really hit me because everything that was normal in my life was seen as alien in the city. My diet was not seen as right. My the way I spoke Tamil was like with a it was a dialect that which is common to where I am from. I would often get teased about speaking Tamil a certain way. My own classmates, almost as if they sense something amiss, they would ask, like, so what are you? Are you Christian? If you're Hindu, are you vegetarian? The way they would ask it is so coded. Unlike the Brahmin community, which still has Iyer, Iyengar, it is not easy to tell who an Nadar is because they will just have their father's first name as a surname. So my second name is my father's first name. My parents never talked about it. They didn't talk to us about it, one, to protect us from the realities of caste, two, because they were too economically privileged. They only lived among Nadars. I wished they'd sat down and kind of thought things through with me, or like went on the journey of understanding why, how caste manifests in our lives, in our daily lives in India. College was difficult. It's a straight up Hindu college where prayers are mandated, where it is vegetarian. The Nadar community, it's like very common to have meat in the morning, meat in the afternoon, meat at night.
It's not just non-vegetarian, but it's all parts of the animal, and
Yes,
and a lot of animals that otherwise Hindu communities don't touch.
no, don't eat.
Yeah.
Yes. But then the truth is, like, a lot of poor communities eat all sorts of things in India. We often talk about the diversity of cuisine. We don't talk about how caste affects the geographies we come from and like the foods that we eat. So I feel like that is a conversation we're slowly starting to have. Food discrimination is a very real thing.
That is something worth exploring, caste and cuisine. Your memoir carries so much pain and yet so much of your breakthrough and finding personal power. So, in this process of writing this book, did you experience re traumatization or healing or a mixture of both? And how did you take care of your mental health while you were unpacking these memories?
I'm very much in active therapy, and I had very, very good support while writing this book because I was diagnosed with complex post traumatic stress disorder much later in life, in my 30s. I always talked openly about sexual violence, which I faced when I was young. But this is the first time in this book that I'm talking much more about other aspects of growing up a girl and how that affected me. One of the ways in which I dealt with some of the subjects that I write about in this book, right from caste to, patriarchal violence or sexual violence, I was able to kind of like go through each memory one at a time, navigating it and taking some time away from it. I would write a chapter and then I would write it as it happened, and then I would process it in therapy through EMDR, movement therapy, where your eye is moving rapidly, but you're trying to process exact moments. So I feel like a lot of the moments that I talked about, I processed it and then when revisited it and wrote it with some emotional distance, because a lot of it is very hard to write about. Family is not easy to write about. Neither is personal experience, because we are taught to not speak about personal experience as much. The book is also gives me a huge sense of closure. It's a huge relief to kind of alleviate the shame.
So, your mother underwent cancer treatment and she did it a lot on her own without the help of your dad. The book kind of talks about that and how that impacted you. I'm sure your sisters as well. Your mother had depression. Your father, there's a mention of psychosis. How has this impacted not just you, but your sisters as well? And how are you now constantly dealing with it?
We often talk about how it each manifests in our life and shows up in our life, even in our 30s. All of us are adults now, all of us in different kinds of relationships. In regard to my parents, I think it was a long grieving process, and I think we don't talk about this enough. We grieve our parents even when they're alive. Like, we grieve the loss of a connection with them as children and then as adult children. And those two, that process is a very hard thing. We often talk about the love for our parents. I don't think we talk about the grief over the disconnect we have generation to generation. There's a lot of pain in Indian families that we don't address. From grief to anger, I like cycle through all those emotions and have come to kind of come to a state of acceptance and peace. Rather, I accept that these events have happened to me. They don't define me in any way, and I have closed the chapter on them. And I have a wonderful future to look forward to. And I will not let the past define me. The sexual assault doesn't define me, the abuse, the patriarchal stuff. None of that defines who I am. If I carried any of that pain forward, I feel like that would be passing on to my daughter and my son the burden of my upholding my happiness, which I don't want them to do.
Transgenerational trauma, the trauma that our parents and their grandparents have faced, and how it's almost, behaviors that are inherited from them. And that's why when people say, you've inherited or someone else has inherited mental health issues, it's more about the behavior that they've inherited or the lack of emotional regulation. How have your parents reacted to your book?
I'm signing a copy and sending it to my mom. She'll have her copy for Christmas. I'll probably understand what what
What
that's going to be like.
what about your sisters?
Oh, my sisters too. I've just sent a few copies to them. They're like just super excited that my cousins have reached out to me. They were deeply empathetic. It's weird. You grow up together, but you actually don't talk about any of the things that really matter because you're in this like performance of normalcy all the time.
Performance of normalcy. It is amazing how Indian families live by that. Looking at the younger Meera in Sivakasi,
Yeah.
the quiet, observant, carrying burdens far beyond her age. What do you wish your parents had understood about your emotional turmoil? What could they have done better for you and your sisters?
Sounds like a terrible thing to say, but I wish my parents were kinder. I think, like in India, we really undervalue kindness to children. I think we often think that we have to be somehow harsh and like children don't know anything. And I feel we really underestimate kindness to children. And I don't think kindness by being giving sweets and, that kind of kindness. I meant like really looking at children as emotional beings, like little human beings who are just trying to make sense of the world and just being empathetic towards them. I wish my parents had that in their lives too, because they didn't. They grew up in a deeply patriarchal society. My mother was, almost groomed for marriage. My father didn't get to do all the things that he wanted to, because he was a man and he just had to take over his family business, whether he liked it or not, or whether he was good at it.
I want to end on a positive note with the chapter
Yeah.
Faith in Nobody, which forms a pivotal part of the book and your own self-discovery, you wanting to be Barkadat. And I want you to read us an excerpt.
Yes, of course. I have my book over here, and I'll show the cover here. It's a lovely cover. I'll read a small excerpt. This chapter is called Faith in Nobody. I didn't know who I wanted to be until I saw Barka Dutt on television in 2004. She was unlike any woman I'd seen in person or on TV. I was a first year college student studying visual communication in Chennai, unanchored and ambitionless, when I heard her voice. She'd covered the Kabul conflict between India and Pakistan in 1999 from the line of control, unafraid of militants and bombs.
Onto the targets in a very short duration of time.
In the brief moments that she appeared on screen, I felt as if I could see my future unfold. I wanted to be Barka Dutt.
So, Meera, I don't know whether you know, I was also at NDTV, and Barka was a senior colleague of mine and continues to
Oh
be.
my goodness.
Yeah, and she continues to be one of the most hardworking journalists I know. And you've had two chance encounters with her, and you've ended the chapter with what she said to you. And I quote, "Oh, dear girl," Barkha said, pulling me into a hug. "Never give up on your dreams."
That is something I'll never forget. I think that was my fan moment. Because I feel like she personified something, and I'm talking about Barka Dutt as an individual, minus the politics, all the criticisms. I'm talking purely as a woman. She symbolized hope. And for me, coming from a small town, to be that um, audacious and to be on television and to kind of like go to war zones and things like that, I thought that was absolutely amazing for a woman to
Here's the
do.
thing, Meera.
Yeah.
I couldn't resist. I reached out to Barkha and sent her the excerpt from your book, and she was most touched.
Oh my goodness. That is so
That,
amazing.
right? But Meera, that's
Oh.
not all. Here is a message from Barkadat, specially for you.
Hi, Meera. I hope you're suitably surprised. Shruti reached out to me, sharing the lovely excerpt from your book, and I have to say, on a maddeningly busy day here in Mumbai, where we're planning a big event, your words really moved me to tears, and they've just meant so much. And on days when sometimes you wonder why we do what we do, what you wrote reminds somebody like me why I do what I do and why I became a journalist. And to feel that one has been able to touch the life of another young girl somewhere, that means everything to me. So more power to you, sending you all the love in the world and repeating what I told you when I met you. Never give up on your dreams. Congratulations on your book and lots of love.
I'm gonna cry. So that is like the best surprise ever. Oh my God, Shruti. What?
Well,
I can't believe it. I'm not gonna like forget this. We have the long weekend here. This is all I'm gonna be talking about.